Joining us is Michael Kaufman. He's with the Center for Naval Analyses. He's their Russia Studies Research Program Director, here to talk about Russia-Ukraine tensions. Mr. Kaufman, thanks for giving us your time today.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Can you elaborate more about the center, the work you do, the position it takes, and how it's funded?
Sure. The center doesn't take any position. It is a federally funded research and development center. It is nonpartisan. Its job is to provide non-biased sort of research and analysis to key parts of the government, and not just the government, other organizations. And the center is also housed within a larger organization called the CNA Corporation. The CNA Corporation is a non-for-profit organization, similar to others you may have heard of, like the RAND Corporation.
When it comes then to specifically actions involving Russia and Ukraine, a lot of ways of looking at it, particularly what do you see playing out not only between the two countries and the United States and Europe for that matter, but also the leadership that's involved in all those decision making?
Sure. Well, the situation right now is incredibly tense and it's rather dangerous. I think there is a higher chance of conflict today than there ever has been since the military operations and offensives of 2014 and 2015. It's a fairly tense standoff. It does look like Russia is putting the pieces in place to conduct a very large-scale military operation. Where they intend to do that has been the subject of extensive debate, both here and across the Atlantic in Europe. Russia naturally denies that they have any offensive intentions towards Ukraine. They have historically denied those offensive intentions, despite launching a number of offensives. So you can take that potentially for what it's worth. And there's a great deal of concern that if there is a renewed or reignited, much larger war, naturally the war has continued between these states since 2014, that this is going to fundamentally change the European security order. It is actually a rather defining moment for European security.
You write in wrote in a recent op-ed this, when it comes to that point, you're saying a large war in Europe is likely coming in the coming weeks. The current security architecture of the continent, the future of NATO, and America's role in shaping security outcomes there all are at stake. Going on, saying Ukraine, whose fate hangs in the balance, may be at the center of the crisis, but Moscow has a greater goal in mind, the revision of Europe's security order. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, that's right. So I've been pessimistic probably throughout in the months running up to this. I thought that a conflict was more likely than not. I think most of the evidence, unfortunately, points to that conclusion. But the Russian demands, which were issued in December, they're not specific to Ukraine. They're about relitigating the post-Cold War settlement and the security architecture of Europe, namely, how security arrangements in Europe are decided, by whom, how security outcomes are decided. Russia wants to be a determining power with a voice in Europe, and more importantly, with a veto. It wants a veto over security arrangements. It wants a veto over who other countries could potentially ally with. It wants privileged sphere of influence, right? It wants a geopolitical space, and it sees its interests or security concerns, right, as having supremacy over the ability of other countries, particularly neighboring countries, being able to choose their own alliances or their own strategic orientation. Right, so this is a defining moment because it fundamentally conflicts with the order in Europe that many European countries have sought to build, and the United States as well. And the United States has been clear that it's not going to compromise on Russia's principal demands. And those demands I can briefly list are: first, no more NATO enlargement. At the top of the list, not enlarging NATO to include countries like Ukraine and Georgia. Second, no further defense cooperation when it comes to key conventional or strategic systems amongst non-NATO members, that is, military basing, selling key weapons technologies, or deploying US weapons in these countries. And third, Russia demands that NATO, and particularly the United States, pulls back military deployments that have taken place in Europe since 1990. Essentially, it calls for a return to pre-1997 military posture, which is a clause that tells the United States and other European states to kind of go back to Germany and what the posture was at the end of the Cold War. And none of those three are really acceptable to the United States or to other European nations.
We saw the German chancellor come to the United States to talk about these issues with President Biden, the French president going and talking with President Putin himself. As far as those two players on the Europe scene, how, as far as allies on this effort, what do they face and the risk they face, and how far they engage with Ukraine?
Sure. So there are challenges because the United States and other European allies and countries, partners, have to coordinate and align policy, right? Looking at the situation today, Not all countries agree about their interpretation of Vladimir Putin's intentions. The United States and countries like the UK are on one page. Germany and France might be on a slightly different page. They might be less concerned that the war is likely, perhaps seeing this as a case of coercive diplomacy, where Russia's just trying to see what it can get. On the other hand, there's also Ukraine, and the Ukraine's leader is in a very difficult position because if he acknowledges that an invasion is very likely, it's going to create panic. The economy is under heavy pressure. Investment is basically running away. And he's concerned that invasion or not, Russia could collapse the Ukrainian economy simply by the threat of it sustained over time. And so he's both trying to paint a sort of tone that Russian aggression is a serious danger right now, while at the same time trying to downplay it and say that, the threat of invasion is unlikely and that the United States is exaggerating it, mainly for political and economic reasons. So he's sort of it's a bit of a schizophrenic political position that he's taken.